October 1st, 331 BCE, on the plains of Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq. Alexander the Great, a young king just 25 years old, faced two choices: fight or starve to death in the desert. Before him stood 100,000 Persian troops, heavy cavalry and armor weighing over a ton, 200 scythe chariots with blades sharp as razors, spinning at 300 rotations per minute, capable of cutting down 20 men in 10 seconds. 15 war elephants, each standing 3 meters tall, weighing 5 tons, trained to charge straight into formations and turn men into ground meat. Behind Alexander, 47,000 men, hungry, thirsty, exhausted. They'd run out of water 2 days ago. A third of his forces were suffering from dysentery after drinking contaminated water. Half of them wanted to surrender. Darius III, the king of kings, the richest man on the planet, had turned the battlefield into a death trap. He'd deployed 10,000 men for 2 weeks to flatten 5 square kilometers of land. Every rock removed, every hole filled. He'd transformed the place into a giant floor, so his 200 scythe chariots could charge at maximum speed without hitting anything. He'd even scattered iron spikes and caltrops in areas where Alexander might retreat. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a slaughterhouse designed to grind the Greeks into dust. And Darius, he'd had goldsmiths forge chains in advance. Not iron chains, but golden ones, to shackle Alexander. He wanted Alexander humiliated as a decoration, not honored as a warrior. He planned to drag this 25-year-old boy through Persian cities like an animal, then hang him before the entire empire. The night before the battle, Darius lit 10,000 torches around the Persian camp. He wanted Alexander to see the size of his army. He wanted the Greeks lying in darkness, trembling as they counted each flame, realizing how they were about to die. The Greek generals begged Alexander, "Attack tonight. It's our only chance." Alexander refused. He said something that made everyone think he was insane. "I will not steal victory. Let Darius know. Even when he's perfectly prepared, I will crush him in broad daylight." Then he went to sleep, slept like a baby. The Persian army stayed awake all night, waiting for an attack that never came. 4 hours later, Darius was running like a coward, abandoning his army, abandoning his 70-year-old mother kneeling in the middle of the battlefield, abandoning his wife and daughters, begging from their chariot. He just turned and ran, tears streaming down his face, blood still dripping from his jaw where an arrow had pierced through. 40,000 Persian soldiers lay dead in the sand. The 15 war elephants, once the ultimate weapon, were now stampeding in panic, trampling their own masters. The 200 scythe chariots lay overturned, wheels still spinning uselessly amid piles of Persian corpses. Alexander, he lost 1,200 men, not 12,000, just 1,200. And 400 of those didn't die from Persian attacks, but were trampled by allied horses when the entire Persian army fled simultaneously, creating a whirlwind of chaos. Darius left behind his 70-year-old mother kneeling in the middle of the battlefield, begging the Greek soldiers not to kill her. She couldn't understand why her son, the king of kings, had fled without turning back to save her. Alexander himself had to lift her up and promise she would remain the queen mother, because Darius was no longer worthy of being called human. The Persian troops fled into the desert without taking water. Many died of thirst within 24 hours, scattered across the sand, mouths gaping, hands still clutching at blood-soaked sand. Those who tried to remove their armor to run faster didn't know how to unbuckle the straps in their panic and strangled themselves with their own metal armor cords. And when Alexander entered the Persian command tent, he found a banquet. The food was still hot. Wine is freshly opened. Musicians stood there, instruments in hand, waiting for orders to play victory music that would never come. Darius had left everything behind, including the feast he'd planned to celebrate when Alexander was chained to his chariot. Alexander sat down, took a sip of Persian wine, and told his generals, "This is what's worth conquering, not kingdoms, but arrogance." By the end of this video, you'll understand why Alexander deliberately moved right instead of attacking head-on, and how this bizarre maneuver caused Darius to destroy his own perfect plan with his own hands. Why 200 scythe chariots, weapons worth a mountain of gold, requiring 2 weeks of ground preparation, killed exactly 0 Greeks, not 10, not 5, but zero. And why Darius, the man who once ruled from Greece to India, abandoned his elderly mother and his family, ran like history's greatest coward, then was assassinated by his own subordinates a year later because they were too ashamed to bear it. This isn't a story about luck. This is a story about a 25-year-old genius who turned an enemy-designed battlefield into their own graveyard in just 4 hours. And it all began with a move that no one, not even Alexander's own generals, understood until it was too late. To understand the scale of the disaster about to befall Persia, we must understand the man Alexander the Great. In 331 BCE, Alexander was only 25 years old, but he'd been king for 5 years and had never lost a battle. His father, Philip II, had transformed Macedon from a backwater kingdom into Greece's perfect war machine. Alexander was trained by Aristotle, learned tactics from the finest generals, and grew up believing he was descended from Achilles. But it wasn't fighting instinct or royal blood that made Alexander. It was his ability to read the battlefield like a 3D chessboard in motion. While other generals saw formations and numbers, Alexander saw psychology, rhythm, and timing. He didn't fight according to plans. He fought on pure instinct honed through thousands of hours of training. And now, after defeating the Persians at Issus 2 years earlier, after conquering Egypt and being crowned pharaoh, Alexander was chasing Darius III to end the war once and for all. The Macedonian army had marched through deserts, over mountains, through lands the Persians had deliberately scorched to starve them. 47,000 men exhausted, thousands of kilometers from home, about to face the largest army ever assembled in the ancient world. And Alexander? He laughed, because he knew something Darius didn't. In war, confidence is sometimes more dangerous than weakness itself. Darius III was no fool. After his defeat at Issus, where he'd fled from Alexander, leaving his mother, wife, and children in enemy hands, Darius had spent 2 years preparing for this rematch. He'd summoned armies from every corner of the world's largest empire. From Bactria to Babylon, from India to Egypt, every province sent warriors. The numbers? Ancient historians claim 1 million men. Modern scholars estimate more conservatively around 100,000 to 120,000 warriors. Whichever number is accurate, Darius's forces outnumbered Alexander's by at least 2 to 1, possibly 3 to 1. But Darius wasn't relying solely on numbers. He had 200 scythe chariots, war chariots with long blades attached to the wheels, designed to charge into enemy formations and tear them apart like mobile meat grinders. He had 15 war elephants from India, massive creatures the Greeks had never faced in combat. He had Scythian cavalry, horse archers as fast as the wind. He had cataphract heavy cavalry, both rider and horse encased in armor, the ancient world's tanks. But Darius's greatest weapon was the battlefield itself. He'd chosen Gaugamela for one reason. The ground was flat as a tabletop. No hills for ambushes, no rivers for cover, no forests for concealment. This was the perfect stage for cavalry and chariots. Moreover, Darius had ordered the ground flattened even further, clearing every stone, every bush. He wanted the battlefield as smooth as a polished floor for his scythe chariots. He'd even scattered iron spikes in certain areas to destroy Alexander's horses' hooves if they gave chase. Darius had turned Gaugamela into a massive trap, and Alexander was walking straight into it. When Macedonian scouts reported the size of the Persian army, some of Alexander's generals advised a night attack. Strike in darkness, when the enemy's overwhelming numbers would become useless. Parmenion, Alexander's oldest and most experienced general, said, "I would accept victory by any means." Alexander looked at the old man and replied coldly, "But I will not steal victory like a thief." This wasn't arrogance. This was psychological warfare. Alexander wanted to defeat Darius under the conditions where Persia felt most confident, on the battlefield Darius himself had prepared. Because when he crushed them there, the Persian Empire's spirit would shatter. No excuses, no ifs or buts. That night, the Persian army stood in formation all night, fearing Alexander would attack by surprise. They didn't sleep, exhausted, tense, standing in darkness, waiting for death. Meanwhile, Alexander ordered his men to sleep. He made sure they ate well and rested fully. He himself slept so soundly that his generals had to wake him the next morning. When they asked how he could sleep before the biggest battle of his life, Alexander smiled. "Why should I worry? We've finally found Darius. He can't run again." This was the confidence of a man who'd already seen the ending before the battle began. When dawn broke on October 1st, 331 BCE, the two greatest armies of the ancient world lined up facing each other on the plains of Gaugamela. On one side, 100,000 Persians in gleaming armor, banners flying, war elephants trumpeting, chariots rolling, cavalry lines stretching to the horizon. On the other hand, 47,000 Macedonians and Greek allies, exhausted, far from home, surrounded by enemies. Any other general would have trembled in fear. Alexander grinned from ear to ear, because while Darius saw numbers, Alexander saw shape. The Persian forces were spread too thin, trying to completely envelop the Macedonian army. That meant their center was weaker, and weaker meant breakable. Alexander had found victory before the first arrow was fired. Alexander's formation was a masterpiece of symmetry and strength. At the center were the phalanxes, blocks of pikemen carrying 5-meter-long sarissa spears. This was the concrete block of the formation, the anchor holding steady while the wings maneuvered. On the right, the position of honor was Alexander's Companion Cavalry, 1 in 800 of Macedon's finest horsemen. Alexander himself would lead them. This was the spear, the offensive weapon. On the left, under Parmenian's command, were the Thessalian cavalry and Greek allies. Their mission? Survive. That's right. Parmenian wasn't ordered to win, only ordered not to lose. Because Alexander knew Darius would try to envelop the left flank, the left only needed to hold out long enough for Alexander to work his magic on the right. Behind the phalanx, Alexander placed reserves in a double formation. If Persian forces circled behind them, the formation would pivot 180 degrees and fight in the opposite direction. Every detail, every position was calculated. This wasn't the formation of a commander hoping for luck. This was the formation of a genius who knew exactly how the battle would unfold. And then Alexander did something no one expected. Instead of advancing straight ahead, he began moving his formation to the right, toward the hillside, away from the area Darius had perfectly prepared for his chariots. Darius panicked. If Alexander moved off the flat ground, the chariots would be useless. The entire plan would collapse. Darius ordered his left wing to shift left to counter Alexander's movement, to keep the Macedonians in the kill zone. But that was exactly what Alexander wanted. By pulling the Persian left wing away, he was creating a gap, an opening in the Persian formation, a direct path to Darius. Alexander had just lured the ancient world's largest army into creating the very hole that would destroy it. The battle hadn't even started, and Alexander was already winning. Darius couldn't wait any longer. His formation was being stretched, his troops exhausted after a sleepless night, and Alexander was escaping the trap zone. Darius ordered the attack. 200 scythe chariots surged forward, wheels spinning wildly, blades gleaming, heading straight for the Macedonian center. This was a terror weapon, designed not just to kill, but to disrupt, to shatter formations through pure fear. But Alexander had anticipated this. As the chariots approached, the phalanxes opened corridors. The pikemen separated, creating gaps, and the chariots charged through harmlessly, like water flowing around rocks. Those chariots that didn't enter the corridors were shot down by javelin throwers, archers, and light infantry from range. Drivers were killed, horses stumbled. The chariot attack, the weapon in which Darius had invested so much hope, dissolved into dust and futility. What remained charged straight into the reserve forces behind the phalanx and was completely annihilated. Within minutes, 200 chariots became piles of scrap metal and corpses. Now came the cavalry's turn. Persian cavalry on the left, as Alexander had predicted, began enveloping the Macedonian right. Scythian cavalry, nimble horse archers, fired arrows and then retreated, inflicting casualties. But Alexander had prepared for this. He had light infantry, javelin throwers, and light cavalry, all positioned on the flank to engage enemy cavalry. They didn't need to win, only to delay, because Alexander was waiting for something else. He was waiting for the gap. On the left, under Parmenian's command, the situation was more dire. Persian cavalry, overwhelming in numbers, flooded toward Parmenion like a tide. The Thessalians fought bravely, but they were being pushed back, surrounded, crushed. Parmenion sent messengers begging for reinforcements from Alexander. But Alexander didn't look toward the left flank. He was staring at the Persian center, because there, exactly as he'd predicted, was a gap. When the Persian cavalry on both flanks charged too far forward, their center stretched thin. The formation tore, and there, like a crack in ice, was the path. A direct path to Darius III, standing in his royal chariot, surrounded by his immortal guards. Alexander had seen the moment he'd been waiting for his entire life. He turned to the Companion Cavalry, the 1,800 finest horsemen of Macedon, and roared a single command: "Follow me!" The Companion Cavalry, led by Alexander on his warhorse Bucephalus, drove into that gap like lightning made of steel. They didn't move in a straight line. They moved in a wedge formation, with Alexander at the tip of the arrow. The wedge is how you break formations, force concentrated, on a single point, drilling into the enemy like a drill bit into wood. And that force? It was Alexander the Great, spear in hand, roaring his ancestors' war songs, charging toward the enemy king. The Persians tried to close the gap. Cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry, wheeled around to intercept. But Alexander was faster. The Companion Cavalry punched through the first line, then the second, blood spraying, armor shattering, men and horses tumbling. Alexander didn't stop to fight. He drove deeper, into the heart of the Persian formation, toward Darius's position. The Immortals, Persia's elite warriors, faced the Companions. These were men trained from childhood to protect their king. They fought fiercely, desperately. Persians threw themselves at Alexander's horse. Some struck at Bucephalus. Some thrust spears at Alexander's shield. But the Companions didn't stop. They pushed, slashed, and killed like an unstoppable wave of steel. And then Darius III saw it. Saw Alexander, covered in blood, riding straight toward him. Saw Alexander's eyes lock onto his. Saw death coming for him. Darius III, emperor of the ancient world's mightiest empire, panicked. He turned his chariot and ran. Not a tactical retreat, not a reorganization, but pure flight. Abandoning his army, abandoning the battle, abandoning his empire. When the Persian army saw Darius's chariot fleeing, they shattered. If their god was running, why should they stay? Panic spread like plague. Cavalry on the right abandoned their attack and turned to flee. The center disintegrated. Even on the left, where the Persians were winning, they heard news of Darius's flight and began retreating. Parmenion, who'd been fighting in desperation, suddenly saw the enemy vanishing before him. The Macedonians, exhausted just minutes before, now became the pursuers. They chased the fleeing Persians, cutting them down from behind, without mercy, without forgiveness. What began as a battle became a massacre. Alexander, with the Companion Cavalry, pursued Darius. They chased for kilometers, across fields, through villages, cutting down anyone who tried to block their path. But Darius had a fresh horse every mile. He'd prepared his escape route. When Bucephalus was too exhausted to continue, Alexander had to stop. Darius escaped again, but this time he had no empire left to run to. When Alexander returned to the battlefield, the sun was setting. What he saw wasn't a battlefield but a slaughterhouse. Persian corpses lay so thick you couldn't see the ground. Blood turned earth into mud. The moans of the dying filled the air. Ancient historians say 40,000 to 90,000 Persians died. The exact number is unknown, but the scale of the catastrophe is undeniable. The Macedonians lost fewer than 500 men. Fewer than 500. In a battle involving 150,000 men, fewer than 500 Macedonians died. The casualty ratio was unimaginable. This wasn't a battle. This was a demonstration of military genius. But the most brutal part? Darius left everything behind. His mother, his wife, his children, all still in the Persian camp, captured as prisoners once again. He left the royal treasury, his chariot, his robes. When the Macedonians entered the Persian camp, they couldn't believe the opulence. Gold, silver, silk, food, wine, all abandoned in the panicked flight. Alexander treated Darius's family well, as he had after Issus. He didn't understand. A king who abandoned his family twice to flee? That wasn't a king. That was a coward. But Alexander had no time to contemplate Darius's weakness. He had an empire to conquer. The aftermath of Gaugamela extended far beyond the battlefield. In a single afternoon, Alexander had broken the back of the Persian Empire. Babylon opened its gates to him without a fight. Susa surrendered. Persepolis, the Persian capital, was captured and later burned. The Persian Empire, which had stood for 200 years, collapsed in months. Darius fled east, trying to gather a new army, but no one trusted him anymore. When a king runs twice, he's no longer a king. A year later, Darius was assassinated by his own generals, who hoped that killing him would satisfy Alexander. They were wrong. Alexander hunted down the assassins and executed them for treason. Darius may have been an enemy, but he was a king, and kings shouldn't die at the hands of traitors. At age 25, Alexander had become master of the largest empire the world had ever seen. But Gaugamela's impact went deeper than territory. The battle proved that tactics beat numbers, that genius beats tradition, that one man with vision could change the world. Modern military historians study Gaugamela as a masterpiece. It's a lesson in using terrain, reading opponents, and creating opportunities where none exist. Alexander didn't win because his men were braver. The Persians were brave too. He won because he thought faster, saw clearer, and acted more decisively. The Companion Cavalry, the wedge formation, the breakthrough into the enemy formation's heart, all have been copied throughout history. From Julius Caesar to Napoleon, from Hannibal to Rommel, every great general learned from Gaugamela. But no one ever did it like Alexander, because Alexander didn't just fight according to plans, he fought with pure instinct refined to perfection. Alexander's true strength wasn't his arm or his courage. It was his ability to see the moment, knowing when not to attack at night, when to let his men sleep, when to move right, when to wait for the gap, and when to charge like a living bullet toward the enemy's heart. Gaugamela wasn't a victory, it was a symphony. Today, the plains of Gaugamela still exist in northern Iraq, near the village of Tel Gamel. There's no monument, no plaque, nothing marking that this is where world history changed forever. Tourists rarely visit, but if you stand there at sunset, you can almost hear it. The thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, the shouts of 150,000 men fighting for the fate of the world. And at the center of it all, a 25-year-old man covered in dust and blood, spear in hand, and eyes locked on a fleeing emperor, proving that greatness doesn't come from numbers, but from vision. That history isn't made by the largest armies, but by the brightest minds. And that sometimes all it takes to change the world is one man, one moment, and the courage to charge into the gap when everyone else sees only death. If you enjoyed this video about Alexander the Great's military genius, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss other legendary battles that change world history. Leave a comment letting me know which battle you want to hear about next. Maybe Hannibal crossing the Alps or Caesar's conquest of Gaul. Thanks for watching.